Okay, picture this. A tiny patch of land, really small, like less than Central Park in New York, just 1 square kilometer.
Right.
It's called Kajiyachō, way out in the Satsuma domain, now Kagoshima, back in the late shogunate days.
Uh-huh. Pretty remote back then.
But somehow this tiny place churned out a whole generation of people who didn't just, tinker with Japan. They fundamentally rebuilt it.
Exactly. And that's what's fascinating and why in this deep dive we're doing something a bit unusual. Our main source text, it's actually this episode itself.
We're diving into ourselves.
Sort of. We're using the structure and content of this episode to unpack that miracle of Kajiyachō. Because as this episode suggests, it wasn't just luck.
Okay, so who are we talking about? Who came out of there?
Well, this episode highlights key figures like Okubo Toshimichi. Think of him as the architect of the modern Japanese government.
The main guy setting up the systems.
Yeah. This episode points out his big idea. Get your house in order first, internal strength before anything else. He pushed for abolishing the old feudal domains, setting up the cabinet, unifying the money system. Huge stuff.
And then there's Saigo Takamori. This episode paints him as more of an idealist.
Very much so. His mantra, mentioned in this episode, was revere heaven, love people. Really crucial in, convincing the old lords to give back their land.
Even though he later led a rebellion.
Right. But as this episode really emphasizes, that didn't totally tarnish his image. He became this, symbol of self-sacrifice, almost a cultural ideal in Japan.
Okay, who else does this episode focus on?
Can't forget Togo Heihachiro, symbol of Japan's modern military might.
The naval hero. Battle of Tsushima.
That's the one. Victor against the Russians. But this episode highlights how he represented a new kind of military thinking. Not just guts and glory.
What do you mean?
He was all about science, rigorous training, technology, calm command. He knew, as this episode suggests, that tech and planning beat sheer bravery in modern war.
Interesting contrast. And there was another naval figure.
Yep. Yamamoto Gonohiro, two-time prime minister, really instrumental in actually building that modern Navy Togo would lead.
Wow. So many heavy hitters from one tiny place.
And this episode makes the point it wasn't just these four. Many other political figures, military leaders, reformers, they laid the foundations right from overthrowing the shogun to setting up the new government, all from Kajiyachō.
So the central question driving this deep dive, using this episode as our guide, is how? Yeah. How did this happen?
Exactly. What was the miracle? This incredible density of nation builders in such a short time, such a small area. This episode frames it not just as individual genius, but about creating systems, shaping civilization itself.
All right, let's dig in. This episode talks about the institutional soil, specifically our Juchu education system. What was that about?
Okay, so the Guchu. What this episode explains is that it was this really unique local thing, a mix of family input and, importantly, autonomous small community groups for the youth.
Like kids teaching kids.
Kind of. Older kids mentored and managed the younger ones, passed on knowledge, sure, but also martial arts, ideology, values. And this episode mentions it involved really strict physical and mental training.
So more than just school. It sounds like character building, group building.
Totally. And this episode highlights a key outcome. You learn to imitate role models, and you develop this fierce loyalty to your group. It wasn't formal school, not just family. This episode calls it a socialization plus paramilitary grassroots model, designed to spot and nurture talent.
Okay, that makes sense. Building cohesion from a young age. Now, this episode also mentions the pressure and autonomy on the periphery. How did geography play a role?
Right. Think about where Kagoshima is. Way down south, far from the political center in Edo. This episode points out this meant some neglect from the shogunate, sure, but it also gave the local Satsuma domain a lot of power within its own borders.
A bit of independence.
Exactly. And they even had outside contact through Ryukyu, as this episode notes. This distance, this episode argues, created a slightly freer space for ideas. Less direct oversight meant maybe you could think bolder thoughts.
And the pressure part.
Well, limited resources, tough geography. This episode stresses they had to be self-reliant, develop their own ways to survive and thrive. This bred, according to this episode, a really strong borderland pride.
A sense of being different, special.
Yeah, and this episode uses this great phrase, they saw themselves as potential seed players for another Japan. This mindset, this drive to maybe challenge the center, grew out of being on the edge.
Okay, so you've got this unique upbringing, this peripheral mindset. Then this episode talks about the time window of crisis, the late shogunate period itself.
Yes, the timing was critical. As this episode lays out, this was when the old order was visibly falling apart. Huge social upheaval.
Plus external threats, right? The famous black ships arriving.
Absolutely. Global colonialism knocking on the door. So you have a weakening central government, elites divided, and this episode argues this created this massive opportunity. Suddenly, unorthodox ideas and people from the periphery, like Kajiyachō, had a chance to rise.
So it wasn't just that they could change things, but the world needed changing right then.
That's the core idea this episode puts forward. It quotes something like, it's not if you have the ability you can change the world, but the world happens to need changing and you are prepared. And the people from Kajiyachō, shaped by their background, were uniquely prepared, as this episode suggests.
But it wasn't just individuals acting alone, was it? This episode brings up the Usubio, the networking effect.
Crucial point in this episode, yeah. Think about it. Okubo, Saigo, Togo, Yamamoto. So many of these key figures literally grew up together in that Guchu system.
Same community, same training.
Exactly. So later, this episode highlights they formed alliances, they worked together, they promoted each other. It wasn't just a collection of brilliant individuals, it was a network of talent. Their shared background amplified their impact. This episode sees them as this trained group, ignited at the right moment by shared goals.
And what about the ideas they carried? This episode talks about a dual inheritance. What do they inherit?
This is where you see their depth, according to this episode. The Kajiyachō elite, people like Saigo and Yama-Iwao, they absorbed two mainstreams.
Okay.
First, strong Confucian roots, emphasis on loyalty, doing the right thing, duty, public order, the traditional virtues.
Right.
But second, this episode points out they also had this real pragmatic streak and a strong military tradition. Satsuma was actually pretty quick to adopt Western military tech, firearms, even sending students abroad.
So tradition plus modern practicality.
And don't forget the Guchu spirit itself, which this episode emphasizes that intense focus on self-sacrifice for the group. That fostered incredible cohesion.
So this blend, traditional ethics, modern tools, group loyalty. This episode argues this is what made them capable.
Precisely. This episode argues this dual inheritance produced a generation capable of building the machinery of a modern state. They had the guts to rebel and the practical skills to build something new.
This seems to lead into a bigger point this episode makes about civilization building. It contrasts how easy it is to destroy versus how hard it is to build.
Yes, a really important insight from this episode. Destroying can be fast, dramatic.
Yeah.
Building a positive, stable order that's slow, complex, takes generations.
And this episode defines building order as needing what? Consensus, institutions, sacrifice.
Yeah, the combination. Common consensus plus execution of institutional design plus willingness to sacrifice short-term interests. And as this episode correctly notes, each one is incredibly difficult.
Why is that?
Well, getting everyone to agree. Consensus is hard. People have different views, biases, wants. Building institutions. That needs long-term vision, open information, choosing people based on merit. This episode implies that's tough. And sacrifice. Well, setting up rules means someone loses out, someone's inconvenienced. It hurts.
So this episode suggests sustainable order isn't built overnight.
Definitely not. This episode emphasizes it's gradual. Generations have to overcome self-interest, manage differences, pay the price through negotiation, trial and error. It contrasts that hard work with how easily demagogues or irrationality can tear things down.
And the Kajiyachō figures are presented in this episode as the builders.
Yes. This episode positions them as the ones who kept their heads in chaos, who compromised, bridged gaps, designed institutions, and pushed them forward. The vital work during that transition.
Now, this episode also zooms back in on two key figures. By them, the relationship is framed as innovation versus counterattack.
Yeah, it's a powerful story within the larger narrative, as this episode presents it. Okubo and Saigo, childhood friends from Kajiyachō, fought together against the shogun.
But ended up on opposite sides.
Fundamentally, Okubo became the pragmatist, driving the modern state forward. Saigo, as this episode explains, got increasingly focused on preserving the samurai class's dignity, that idealistic self-sacrifice narrative, especially after the Meiji Restoration started rolling.
And this led to the Soho, the Satsuma Rebellion.
Exactly, led by Saigo. This episode doesn't see it as just a policy dispute, but as this deep tension playing out. Representatives of the old order clashing with the builders of the new during a massive societal shift.
A sobering point this episode makes. Even reformers can end up resisting the changes they helped start.
If their identity or ideas remain tied too strongly to the past, yeah, it happens.
Okay, one last comparison this episode draws to the two Shier, or gods of war, Wall and Auflaidien. How are they different?
It's a really interesting contrast highlighted in this episode, both revered but in different ways. Saigo represents, the spiritual side. Idealism, loyalty, self-sacrifice, almost the embodiment of traditional Bushido.
Even though he lost his final battle.
Especially because of how he faced it. This episode notes his posthumous reverence as Saigo-sensei. His legacy, according to this episode, is more about that idealistic spirit than military wins.
And Togo.
Togo is the modern military hero, the victory at Tsushima. This episode portrays him as representing success through modern means. Technology, organization, training, national will. That famous quote, "The fate of the empire depends on this battle." Pure mobilization.
So different kinds of strength, different eras.
Precisely. This episode suggests Saigo's spirit was maybe the final, tragic flowering of the old samurai way, while Togo's victory marked Japan's arrival as a modern power. And this episode adds that Togo's win resonated globally, seen as a symbol of non-Western power challenging colonialism, inspiring others in Asia.
So wrapping up, this episode concludes with a more personal reflection, connecting to Saigo.
Yeah, a reflection for me, actually, thinking about my own life, starting small, traveling widely, contemplating what widening your life radius really means.
Contrasting your physical travel with Saigo, who died close to where he was born.
Right. He barely left his region physically. I've been all over. But this episode poses the question to you, the listener. Today, with all our mobility and information, what truly expands our radius? Is it just covering ground? Or is it the depth, the reach, the impact of our ideas and actions?
So this whole deep dive into this episode itself
is a way to look at the world from Kajiyachō's perspective, maybe. To think about order building through figures like Saigo. It's just a reflection, offered humbly, hoping it sparks something for you.
So the key takeaway we've pulled from analyzing this episode is that extraordinary change can emerge from the unlikeliest of places. Even a tiny remote community.
If the conditions align, yes. The soil, the pressure, the timing, the network, the ideas.
And the final thought this episode leaves us with is to consider our own context.
Yeah. Think about your own radius, your own community, your skills, your opportunities. How can you leverage where you are to create something meaningful? What kind of order builder might you be in your own way?
A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.